The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Riverside Academy as 12-year-old David Johnson stepped through the heavy oak doors. His worn sneakers squeaked softly against the pristine surface, a sound that seemed to echo through the grand hallway like a reminder that he didn't belong here. David clutched his backpack tighter, feeling the weight of his grandmother's hopes pressing down on his shoulders. The bag was old and patched in several places, a stark contrast to the designer backpacks he'd seen other students carrying in the parking lot. Inside were his most precious possessions: a notebook filled with his grandmother's encouraging words, a pencil worn down to a stub, and the acceptance letter for today's scholarship interview. The walls around him told stories of privilege and tradition. Oil paintings of distinguished-looking men and women stared down from golden frames, their eyes seeming to follow his every step. Trophy cases lined the corridors, filled with awards and achievements dating back decades. Everything about this place whispered of money, prestige, and a world that felt completely foreign to a boy from the east side of town. His grandmother, Betty Johnson, had worked 3 cleaning jobs just to save enough money for the application fee. She'd spent countless nights scrubbing office floors and washing dishes at a local diner, all while encouraging David to dream bigger than their small apartment and struggling neighborhood. When the letter arrived offering him a chance to interview for a full scholarship, she had cried tears of joy and pride. "You got something special in you, baby," she had told him the night before, her weathered hands gentle as she helped him prepare. "Don't you let nobody tell you different. You walk in there with your head held high, you hear me?" Now, standing in this intimidating hallway, David tried to remember those words, but doubt crept in like a cold draft. Everyone he'd seen so far looked like they belonged to a different world. Their clothes were expensive. Their voices carried the confident tone of people who'd never wondered where their next meal would come from. And they moved through these halls like they owned them. The secretary's desk sat at the end of the main corridor, positioned like a checkpoint between the entrance and the rest of the school. Behind it, David could see glimpses of what lay beyond. Classrooms with state-of-the-art equipment, a library that looked like something from a movie, and students who seemed to glide rather than walk. As he approached the desk, David noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Through an open doorway to his left, he caught sight of the most beautiful piano he'd ever seen. It was massive, its black surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the crystal chandelier hanging above it. The instrument seemed to call to him, and for a moment, all his nervousness faded away. Music had always been David's escape. In his grandmother's small apartment, they had an old keyboard that she'd bought at a yard sale for $20. Half the keys stuck and it was missing its stand, but David had spent countless hours on that broken instrument, teaching himself to play by ear and dreaming of someday touching a real piano. The secretary, a kind-looking woman in her 50s, smiled warmly when she saw him approach. "You must be David," she said, checking her appointment book. "Right on time. I'm Mrs. Rodriguez. The headmaster will see you in just a few minutes." David nodded politely, trying to keep his voice steady. "Thank you, ma'am. You can have a seat right there." She pointed to a row of chairs positioned across from her desk. "Can I get you some water while you wait?" The simple kindness in her voice almost brought tears to his eyes. After feeling so out of place since walking through the front doors, her genuine warmth was like finding an oasis in a desert. "No thank you, ma'am. I'm fine." As David settled into the chair, he couldn't help but steal glances at the piano through the open doorway. From where he sat, he could see its keys gleaming in the soft light, and his fingers unconsciously moved as if he were playing an invisible keyboard on his lap. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hallway, growing louder and more deliberate with each step. David looked up to see a woman walking toward them, and immediately knew that this person was someone important. Everything about her screamed wealth and authority, from her perfectly styled hair to her designer outfit that probably cost more than his grandmother made in a month. This was Victoria Ashford, though David didn't know her name yet. She was the wife of the academy's founder and served on the school's board of directors. More than that, she was someone who had built her entire identity around maintaining what she called the school's standards and tradition. In her mind, Riverside Academy was a place for a certain type of family, a certain level of society, and she had made it her personal mission to keep it that way. Mrs. Ashford's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she approached the secretary's desk. Her eyes swept over the area with the practiced gaze of someone inspecting her domain. And when her gaze landed on David, her expression shifted subtly. It was nothing dramatic, just a slight tightening around her eyes and a barely perceptible straightening of her posture. But David felt the change immediately. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone used to being obeyed without question. "What is that doing here?" The question hit David like a physical blow. She hadn't even tried to lower her voice or show any consideration for his feelings. She spoke about him as if he were an object, something that didn't belong and needed to be removed. Mrs. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly caught between her professional duties and her discomfort with Mrs. Ashford's rudeness. "This is David Johnson. Mrs. Ashford, he's here for his scholarship. Interview with the headmaster." The way Mrs. Ashford's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't quite a frown either, made David's stomach turn. It was an expression he'd seen before, on the faces of people who looked at him and saw only his old clothes, his neighborhood, the color of his skin, and decided they knew everything they needed to know about who he was and what he was worth. "Another charity case," she said, the words dripping with disdain. "How many of these do we really need to interview? We have standards to maintain at this institution." Each word felt like a slap. David's face burned with a mixture of embarrassment and anger that he tried desperately to hide. His grandmother had taught him to be respectful to adults, to keep his composure even when others didn't show him the same courtesy. But sitting there and listening to this woman talk about him like he was nothing tested every lesson in self-control he'd ever learned. Mrs. Rodriguez looked mortified. "Mrs. Ashford, perhaps we could discuss this privately." But Mrs. Ashford waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense. The boy needs to understand what kind of institution this is. We're not some public school where anyone can just walk in off the street." David kept his eyes fixed on his hands, which were clenched tightly in his lap. He could feel his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Part of him wanted to stand up and walk out, to spare himself any more of this humiliation. But he thought about his grandmother, about all the nights she'd come home exhausted from work but still found time to help him with his homework, about all the sacrifices she'd made to give him this chance. The injustice of it all made his chest tight with emotion. He'd done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve being treated like this. He'd studied hard, maintained perfect grades, and earned this interview through his own merit. Yet here was this woman, judging him based on nothing more than his appearance and her own prejudices. As Mrs. Ashford continued her commentary about standards and appropriate candidates, David's eyes drifted back to the piano visible through the doorway. Looking at that beautiful instrument gave him a small measure of peace, a reminder of the one place where none of this ugliness could touch him. When he played music, it didn't matter what neighborhood he came from or what clothes he wore. The only thing that mattered was the connection between his heart and the keys. He remembered the first time he'd ever heard classical music. His grandmother had been cleaning an office building downtown, and she'd brought him with her one evening when her usual babysitter was sick. In one of the offices, someone had left a radio playing, and the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard was flowing from the speakers. It was a piano piece, complex and emotional, and it had stopped him in his tracks. That night he'd asked his grandmother about it, and she'd used her phone to help him find the piece online. It was Chopin, she'd discovered, and from that moment David had been obsessed with learning everything he could about classical piano music. He'd spent hours watching videos, studying the way great pianists moved their hands, memorizing pieces note by note. The old keyboard in their apartment became his practice space, his sanctuary, his connection to something beautiful in a world that often felt harsh and unfair. He taught himself to read music using library books and free online resources, practicing until his fingers ached and his grandmother had to remind him to come eat dinner. Mrs. Ashford's voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. "Are you even listening, boy?" David looked up, realizing she was now addressing him directly. "Yes, ma'am. I was saying that you need to understand what kind of institution this is. This isn't a place for everyone, eh?" Mrs. Ashford's eyes gleamed with the cold satisfaction of someone who believed they were about to deliver a perfect lesson in humility. She had noticed how the boy's gaze kept wandering toward the music room, and in her mind, this presented the ideal opportunity to demonstrate exactly why children like him didn't belong at Riverside Academy. "I see you looking at that piano," she said, her voice taking on a tone that was somehow both sweet and venomous at the same time. "Tell me, boy, do you have any idea what you're looking at?" David met her gaze steadily, though his heart was racing. "It's a piano, ma'am." Mrs. Ashford let out a laugh that held no warmth whatsoever. "Oh, it's much more than just a piano, child. That is a Steinway Model D concert grand piano. Do you know what that means?" When David shook his head silently, her smile grew wider and more predatory. She was in her element now, about to educate this presumptuous boy about the vast gulf between his world and hers. "That piano cost more than $200,000, she announced, watching his face carefully for the reaction she expected. "It's the same model used in concert halls around the world, played by the greatest pianists who have ever lived. It's a work of art, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that takes years to create and a lifetime to truly appreciate." Mrs. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably behind her desk, sensing where this conversation was headed, and not liking it one bit. She'd worked at the academy long enough to know Mrs. Ashford's methods, and she'd seen how the woman took particular pleasure in putting people in their place, especially those she deemed beneath her station. David absorbed this information quietly, his eyes returning to the magnificent instrument. $200,000 was more money than he could truly comprehend. It was more than his grandmother would make in several years of working multiple jobs. Yet somehow knowing the piano's value didn't intimidate him, the way Mrs. Ashford clearly hoped it would. Instead, it made him appreciate even more how beautiful the instrument was, how much skill and artistry had gone into creating something so perfect. Mrs. Ashford continued her lecture, her voice dripping with condescension. "That piano has been played by graduates of Juilliard, by students who have studied music theory since they could walk, by young people whose families have cultivated their musical education for generations. It requires a certain level of sophistication to even approach such an instrument." She paused dramatically, letting her words sink in before delivering what she believed would be the killing blow. "It's not something you just figure out on your own." The way she said those last words made it clear that she somehow knew about David's self-taught musical education, or at least suspected it. Perhaps she'd made assumptions based on his appearance, his obvious lack of money, the fact that he was here on a scholarship interview rather than as a paying student. David felt a flash of anger at her dismissive tone, but he kept his expression neutral. His grandmother had taught him that sometimes the best response to a cruelty was simply to maintain your dignity and let your actions speak louder than any words ever could. Mrs. Ashford began walking toward the music room, her heels clicking against the marble floor with each deliberate step. She gestured for David to follow her, and though every instinct told him this was a trap, he found himself standing and walking behind her. The music room was even more impressive up close. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden rays across the polished black surface of the Steinway. The room itself was designed like a small concert hall, with perfect acoustics and elegant furnishings that spoke of serious musical study. "You know," Mrs. Ashford said, running her manicured fingers along the piano's edge, "I've been playing piano since I was 4 years old. I studied at the Whitmore Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. I've performed at charity galas attended by governors and senators." She turned to face David, her expression a mixture of pride and malice. "This piano and we understand each other. It responds to proper technique, to years of training, to the kind of musical education that money can buy." David remained silent, but his eyes were fixed on the keys with an intensity that Mrs. Ashford mistook for simple awe. She couldn't see the way his fingers were unconsciously moving, couldn't know that in his mind he was already hearing music flowing from this incredible instrument. "I'll tell you what," Mrs. Ashford said suddenly, her tone shifting to something that sounded almost friendly, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of cruelty. "I'm going to make you an offer. A challenge, if you will." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, clearly concerned about what was happening. "Mrs. Ashford, perhaps the headmaster is ready to see David now?" But Mrs. Ashford waved her away with an imperious gesture. "This will only take a moment. I'm sure our young friend here would appreciate the opportunity I'm about to give him." She turned back to David, and her smile was the kind that wolves might wear before pouncing on their prey. "Here's my proposal, boy. If you can play this piano, and I mean really play it, not just bang on the keys like some amateur, then I will personally recommend you for acceptance into this academy." David's eyes widened slightly. It was the first sign of real emotion he'd shown since this entire ordeal began. Mrs. Ashford continued, clearly enjoying herself. I'll write a letter to the board of directors explaining how impressed I was by your musical abilities. I'll tell them that you represent exactly the kind of student Riverside Academy should be proud to have. She paused, letting the magnitude of her offer sink in. For a boy in David's position, a personal recommendation from someone as influential as Mrs. Ashford could indeed make all the difference in his acceptance. However, she continued, and now her voice took on the hard edge that revealed her true intentions. When you fail, and you will fail, you will leave this building immediately and never return. You'll withdraw your application, forget about this scholarship, and find somewhere more appropriate for someone of your background. The challenge hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Mrs. Rodriguez looked horrified, understanding exactly what Mrs. Ashford was doing. This wasn't about giving David an opportunity. It was about humiliating him so thoroughly that he would never again dare to reach for something she believed was beyond his station. David stood perfectly still, his mind racing. He understood the trap that was being set for him. Mrs. Ashford expected him to fail, expected to watch him embarrass himself trying to play an instrument far beyond his abilities, and then she would have the satisfaction of sending him away in shame. But as he looked at that beautiful piano, David felt something stirring inside him that had nothing to do with Mrs. Ashford's expectations or her cruel intentions. He felt the same sensation he always experienced when he sat down at his grandmother's old keyboard, a sense of coming home, of connecting with something larger and more beautiful than the harsh realities of everyday life. What do you say, boy? Mrs. Ashford pressed, clearly confident in the outcome. Do you accept my challenge? David thought about his grandmother, probably at work right now cleaning someone else's office building, dreaming of the day when her grandson might walk the halls of a place like this as a student, rather than a visitor. He thought about all the nights he'd practiced on that broken keyboard, all the hours he'd spent watching videos and studying music, all the pieces he'd memorized note by note, until they were as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. Most of all, he thought about what his grandmother had told him the night before. You got something special in you, baby. Don't you let nobody tell you different. Mrs. Ashford was studying his face, reading what she interpreted as fear and uncertainty. In her mind, the boy was already defeated. She was simply waiting for him to acknowledge his defeat and slink away with his tail between his legs. I don't have all day, she said impatiently. What's it going to be? David looked up at her, and for the first time since this conversation had begun, he spoke with complete confidence. Yes, ma'am. I accept your challenge. The words seemed to echo in the quiet music room. Mrs. Rodriguez gripped the doorframe, silently praying that this boy knew what he was doing. Mrs. Ashford's smile grew even wider, convinced that she was about to witness the complete humiliation of this presumptuous child. Excellent, she said, stepping back from the piano with a theatrical flourish. Please be my guest. Show us what someone from your background can do with a real piano. Her tone made it clear that she expected nothing more than embarrassing noise, random key pressing, perhaps a fumbling attempt at chopsticks, or some other elementary tune that would confirm everything she believed about the vast differences between people like her and people like David. What she couldn't see was the way David's entire demeanor had shifted the moment he'd accepted the challenge. The nervousness that had been radiating from him since he'd walked into the building was gone, replaced by a calm focus that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within him. As he approached the piano bench, David felt the familiar sensation of everything else fading away. Mrs. Ashford's presence, the intimidating grandeur of the academy, even his own worries about the scholarship interview, all of it receded into the background as he focused entirely on the instrument before him. The moment David's fingers touched the keys of the Steinway, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted like the air before a thunderstorm. Mrs. Ashford stood with her arms crossed, her lips curved in anticipation of the embarrassing cacophony she expected to hear. Mrs. Rodriguez held her breath in the doorway, silently hoping against hope that this young man somehow knew what he was doing. David closed his eyes for just a moment, feeling the weight and responsiveness of the keys beneath his fingertips. This piano was unlike anything he'd ever touched before. Where his grandmother's old keyboard had keys that stuck and sounds that were thin and electronic, This instrument responded to the slightest pressure with rich, resonant tones that seemed to fill not just the room but his very soul. When he opened his eyes and began to play, the first notes that emerged were soft and contemplative, the opening measures of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Mrs. Ashford's smug expression flickered for just a moment as she recognized the piece, but she quickly recovered. Many amateur pianists could stumble through the opening of famous classical pieces. It was what came next that separated the truly skilled from the pretenders. The melody began simply, almost conversationally, as if the piano were telling a story to anyone willing to listen. David's hands moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone his age, his left hand providing a gentle but complex accompaniment while his right hand carried the main theme with touching sensitivity. Mrs. Ashford felt the first flutter of unease in her stomach. This wasn't the random key banging she had expected. This was actual music, played with technique that suggested serious training. But surely the boy would falter when the piece became more demanding. Chopin's ballads were notoriously difficult, full of technical challenges that could trip up even experienced pianists. As if responding to her thoughts, David began to guide the music into more complex territory. His hands crossed and recrossed with practiced ease, his fingers finding intricate passages that required years of study to master. The gentle opening theme began to develop and transform, growing more passionate and urgent with each passing measure. Students walking through the hallway outside began to slow their steps, drawn by the unexpected sound of masterful piano playing. A few peeked into the music room, their faces showing surprise at seeing an unfamiliar boy at the piano, playing with a skill that surpassed many of their own music teachers. Mrs. Rodriguez found herself leaning against the doorframe, her eyes wide with amazement. In all her years at the academy, she had never heard student playing of this caliber. The boy's technique was flawless, but more than that, he was making the music breathe with emotional depth that spoke of genuine artistic understanding. Mrs. Ashford's confidence began to crack like ice under pressure. The piece was building toward its first major climax, a section that required not just technical skill but interpretive maturity. Surely this was where the boy would reveal his limitations, where his lack of proper training would finally show itself. Instead, David navigated the challenging passage with breathtaking assurance. His hands flew across the keyboard with precision and grace, each note placed exactly where it needed to be to serve the musical line. The crescendo built with perfect control, neither rushed nor held back, but timed with the instincts of someone who truly understood the composer's intentions. The music room's acoustics, designed for professional-level performances, carried every nuance of David's playing throughout the space. The Steinway's rich voice responded to his touch like an eager partner in a dance, producing colors and textures that brought Chopin's composition fully to life. As the first major section of the ballad concluded and moved into the more lyrical second theme, Mrs. Ashford felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine shock. This wasn't just competent playing. This was artistry of the highest order, the kind of musical communication that she had only heard from graduates of the most elite conservatories. The second theme flowed from David's fingers like poetry made audible. Where the opening had been contemplative and the first climax passionate, this section was pure beauty, each phrase shaped with sensitivity that revealed layers of meaning in Chopin's writing. His rubato, the subtle speeding up and slowing down that gave classical music its breathing quality, was perfect, never mannered or artificial but always serving the expression of the music. More students had gathered in the hallway, and even some teachers had stopped to listen. Word was spreading quickly through the building that something extraordinary was happening in the music room. The Academy's own music director, Dr. Harrison, appeared at Mrs. Rodriguez's shoulder, his face a study in amazement. "Who is that?" he whispered. "David Johnson," Mrs. Rodriguez replied quietly. "He's here for a scholarship interview." Dr. Harrison listened more intently, his trained ear analyzing the performance. "That's the Chopin G minor ballade. Do you realize how difficult that piece is? I wouldn't assign it to a student unless they had at least 8 years of serious training." Mrs. Ashford heard this exchange, and it felt like a knife twisting in her stomach. 8 years of serious training. How was this possible? The boy was clearly from a background that couldn't afford expensive music lessons, yet he was playing with the skill of someone who had studied at the finest conservatories. David was now approaching the piece's most challenging section, where Chopin's writing became increasingly complex and demanding. This was the part that required not just finger technique, but deep musical understanding, the ability to balance multiple melodic lines while maintaining the overall architectural structure of the composition. His concentration was absolute. Everything else in the world had ceased to exist except for the music flowing from his hands and the keys responding to his touch. This was the feeling he lived for, the reason he had spent countless hours practicing on his grandmother's broken keyboard, dreaming of someday playing on an instrument like this. The technical demands of the piece seemed to pose no challenge for him whatsoever. His fingers moved with the kind of independence and control that typically took years to develop, each hand maintaining its own musical line while contributing to the whole. The crossing of hands, the rapid scales, the delicate ornamentations, all of it flowed as naturally as conversation. But technique alone, impressive as it was, wasn't what was holding his audience spellbound. It was the musical intelligence behind every choice he made, the way he shaped each phrase to reveal new meanings in music that many of them had heard dozens of times before. This wasn't just playing notes. This was storytelling of the highest order. Mrs. Ashford felt her worldview crumbling around her like a house built on sand. Everything she had believed about superiority, about the relationship between privilege and ability, about who deserved to occupy spaces like Riverside Academy, was being challenged by the undeniable evidence of her own ears. The ballade continued to unfold, moving through its various sections with David as a sure guide. He took the music through moments of introspection and passages of dramatic intensity, always maintaining the perfect balance between technical control and emotional expression. His understanding of the piece's structure was evident in the way he paced the larger climaxes, building tension and releasing it with the timing of a master storyteller. Students continued to gather in the hallway, and the soft murmur of amazed conversations could be heard even over the music. Several people were recording with their phones, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing something special, something worth remembering. "I can't believe this," one student whispered to another. "He's playing better than Professor Williams." "Who is he?" came the response. "I've never seen him before." "Look at his clothes," another voice observed, not unkindly but with genuine curiosity. "He's not from here. But listen to that playing." Dr. Harrison was studying David's technique with professional interest. "His hand position is perfect," he murmured to Mrs. Rodriguez. "Look at how relaxed his shoulders are, how efficiently he moves. That kind of technique doesn't happen by accident. Someone taught him properly." As the ballad moved into its final section, David began to build toward the piece's ultimate climax. This was where Chopin had poured all his genius for combining technical brilliance with emotional depth, creating music that demanded everything a pianist could give: finger technique, musical sensitivity, physical endurance, and interpretive maturity. Mrs. Ashford watched in growing horror as David approached these passages without any sign of intimidation or uncertainty. His playing had been building throughout the performance, each section more impressive than the last, and now he was attacking the most difficult parts of the piece with complete confidence. The cascading runs and thunderous chords that marked the ballad's climax emerged from the Steinway with breathtaking power and clarity. David's entire body was engaged now, his back straight but relaxed, his arms moving with controlled precision to produce the massive sounds that Chopin had written into the score. Yet even in these moments of peak intensity, his playing never became harsh or unmusical. Every note, no matter how fast or loud, was placed with intention and care. The balance between the different voices in the music remained clear, even when the volume reached its peak. The silence that followed David's performance stretched on like a held breath, thick with tension and disbelief. Mrs. Ashford stood frozen, her face pale and her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. The confident woman who had issued her cruel challenge just minutes before seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone who looked like she had witnessed something impossible. Dr. Harrison was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. That was extraordinary." He stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on David with the kind of respect usually reserved for accomplished professionals. "Young man, where did you study? Who was your teacher?" Mrs. Rodriguez dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, still overcome by the beauty of what she had just heard. The students gathered in the hallway began to murmur among themselves, their voices filled with awe and curiosity about this mysterious boy who had just delivered a performance that surpassed anything they had ever heard within these walls. David remained seated at the piano bench, his hands still resting quietly in his lap. The intensity of the performance had left him drained but peaceful, the way he always felt after losing himself completely in music. For a moment he had forgotten about Mrs. Ashford's challenge, forgotten about the scholarship interview, forgotten about everything except the pure joy of making music on an instrument worthy of his abilities. Mrs. Ashford finally found her voice, though it came out as a broken whisper. Where did you learn to play like that?" The question hung in the air, carrying with it the weight of all her shattered assumptions. This boy, whom she had dismissed as unworthy of even entering the academy, had just demonstrated a level of musical artistry that she, with all her expensive training and privileged background, could never hope to achieve. David looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw not triumph or smugness, but simply the quiet dignity that had carried him through her earlier cruelty. When he spoke, his voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than revealing the source of his extraordinary gift. "My grandmother works as a cleaning lady," he said simply. "She has contracts with several office buildings downtown. One of them is the Metropolitan Music Conservatory." Dr. Harrison leaned forward, immediately understanding the significance of this information. The Metropolitan was one of the most prestigious music schools in the region, known for producing world-class musicians and maintaining the highest standards of excellence. David continued, his voice growing stronger as he told his story. "She usually brings me with her when she works the night shift there, especially during school breaks. The building is supposed to be empty, but there's always one person still there, Mr. Chen, the night security guard." Mrs. Ashford felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand where this story was heading. "Mr. Chen used to be a concert pianist back in China," David explained, his respect and affection for the man evident in his voice. "He graduated from the Shanghai Conservatory and performed with orchestras all over Asia. But when he came to America 15 years ago, he couldn't get his credentials recognized. The language barrier made it difficult for him to find work in music, so he took the security job to support his family." The injustice of this revelation hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Here was a master musician, someone who had achieved the highest levels of musical excellence, reduced to working as a security guard because the system couldn't see past language barriers and bureaucratic obstacles to recognize his true worth. "At first, he just watched me looking at the practice rooms while my grandmother worked," David continued. "I guess he could tell I was interested in music. One night he asked if I wanted to hear him play." David's face lit up with the memory. "It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. He played this old Chinese folk song on one of the practice pianos, and I knew I had to learn how to make music like that." Dr. Harrison was hanging on every word, beginning to piece together the remarkable story of how this young man had received what amounted to a world-class musical education in the most unlikely circumstances. "Mr. Chen started teaching me that same night," David said. "At first it was just basic technique, how to sit, how to hold my hands, how to make clean sounds. But he quickly realized that I had good ears and good instincts, so he began teaching me more advanced concepts." Mrs. Ashford's legs felt weak, and she had to steady herself against the piano. The boy was describing an education that, in terms of quality if not cost, rivaled anything the most expensive conservatories could provide. "We worked together 3 nights a week for 4 years, David continued. "Mr. Chen taught me everything: music theory, technique, interpretation, music history. He made me practice scales and etudes until my fingers could move independently. He taught me to read music fluently and to understand the structure of different musical forms." He gestured toward the piano with obvious affection. "But more than that, he taught me to listen to what the music was trying to say. He showed me that technique is just the beginning, that real musicianship comes from understanding the emotions and stories that composers put into their works." The students in the hallway were listening with rapt attention, many of them recording David's story on their phones. Here was something far more compelling than just a talented performance. This was a story of dedication, perseverance, and the power of music to transcend social and economic barriers. Mr. Chen wouldn't let me learn pieces that were too easy. David continued with a slight smile. He said that if I was going to spend time learning music, I should learn the greatest music ever written. So he started me on Bach, then moved me to Mozart and Beethoven, and eventually to Chopin and Liszt. Dr. Harrison shook his head in amazement. That's exactly the progression we use in our advanced program here. Your Mr. Chen designed a curriculum that matches what we do with our most serious students. He said I had to understand the language of classical music fluently if I wanted to speak it properly, David explained. So we studied score analysis, harmony, counterpoint, all the things that help you understand why composers made the choices they did. Mrs. Ashford realized that this boy had received not just technical training but a comprehensive musical education that addressed every aspect of serious piano study. The quality of his performance suddenly made perfect sense. He hadn't just learned to play pieces. He had learned to think like a musician. But how did you practice? Mrs. Rodriguez asked from the doorway. Surely you didn't have access to the conservatory's pianos outside of those nights with Mr. Chen. David's expression grew more humble. My grandmother saved up $20 to buy me an old keyboard at a yard sale. Half the keys stuck and the sound wasn't very good, but it was enough to practice finger exercises and memorize pieces. Mr. Chen would assign me things to work on, and I'd practice them at home, then show him my progress when we met again. The image of this talented boy practicing for hours on a broken keyboard, driven by pure love of music and determination to improve, brought fresh tears to Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes. It also made Mrs. Ashford feel sick with shame as she thought about her own privileged musical education and how little she had appreciated it. Mr. Chen also helped me with my English homework, David added with obvious gratitude. My grandmother never had the chance to finish school, so she couldn't help me with academic subjects. Mr. Chen would check my assignments and help me with difficult concepts. He said education was just as important as music. Dr. Harrison was nodding approvingly. A true teacher, he understood that musical development and intellectual development go hand in hand. When I told him about this scholarship opportunity, David continued, he helped me prepare. We worked extra hard on pieces that would show different aspects of my abilities. The Chopin Ballade was his suggestion. He said it would demonstrate both technical skill and musical maturity. Mrs. Ashford finally found her voice, though it came out strained and barely recognizable. I don't understand. If you had access to this level of training, why didn't you apply to music conservatories? Why are you here seeking a general scholarship? David's answer revealed yet another layer of wisdom that was remarkable for someone his age. Mr. Chen advised me to get a broad education first. He said that the greatest musicians aren't just technically skilled. They're well-educated people who understand literature, history, science, and culture. He thought I should go to a school like this one, where I could continue my musical development while also preparing for college. The logic was impeccable, and Dr. Harrison nodded enthusiastically. He's absolutely right. The most successful musicians today are those who can think broadly and communicate effectively about many subjects. Mrs. Ashford looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. Dr. Harrison's obvious respect for David's abilities. Mrs. Rodriguez's continued amazement. The admiring expressions of the students in the hallway. Everyone could see what she had been blind to. This young man possessed not just extraordinary talent, but the kind of character, wisdom, and dedication that any institution would be honored to claim. The weight of her own behavior crashed down on her like a collapsing building. She had tried to humiliate a child based on nothing more than his appearance and her own prejudices. David stood quietly beside the piano, his posture straight and dignified despite everything he had endured. The room remained silent, everyone waiting to hear what he would say next. Mrs. Ashford's face was pale, her earlier confidence completely shattered by the realization that she would now have to honor a promise she had never expected to keep. Mrs. Ashford, David said, his voice calm and measured, I want you to know that I don't need your recommendation anymore. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of surprise throughout the room. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose. Dr. Harrison looked puzzled, and even the students in the hallway murmured with confusion. Mrs. Ashford herself felt a mixture of relief and something else, something that might have been disappointment, though she couldn't quite understand why. David continued, his gaze steady as he looked directly at her. When I walked into this building today, I was nervous and intimidated. I felt like I didn't belong here. Like maybe people were right to question whether someone like me deserved a chance at a place like this. His words carried no self-pity, just honest reflection on his earlier feelings. But after what just happened, after the way you treated me before you knew anything about who I am or what I can do, I realized something important. I don't want to be part of an institution that judges people the way you judged me. Mrs. Ashford felt each word like a dagger to her heart. The boy was rejecting not just her recommendation, but the entire system she represented, the world she had spent her life defending and maintaining. "I've seen how you treat people you think are beneath you," David continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've heard the assumptions you make about worth and value based on nothing more than appearance and background. And I've decided that I'd rather earn my place honestly than accept help from someone who offered it for the wrong reasons." Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his face showing concern. "David, please don't let one person's behavior influence your decision about this entire institution. What Mrs. Ashford said and did was wrong, but it doesn't represent the values of Riverside Academy as a whole." David turned to look at the music director, and his expression softened slightly. "Dr. Harrison, I can see that you're a good person, and I'm sure there are many others here who are as well. But the fact that Mrs. Ashford felt comfortable treating me the way she did in front of others suggests that her attitudes aren't as unusual as you might like to believe." The observation stung because it carried an uncomfortable grain of truth. Mrs. Ashford's behavior had been extreme, but the underlying attitudes that had driven it were not uncommon in the rarefied world of elite private education. Mrs. Rodriguez found her voice, speaking with obvious emotion. "David, you have extraordinary talent. Don't let this experience prevent you from getting the education you deserve." David smiled at her, the first genuine smile he'd shown since entering the building. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez. Your kindness means more to me than you know, but I think there might be better places for me to grow, places where I'll be valued for who I am, rather than having to prove my worth through challenges and tests." Mrs. Ashford felt compelled to speak, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I was wrong. About everything. Your performance was beautiful. Extraordinary. I've never heard anything like it." David looked at her with an expression that was neither angry nor forgiving, but something more complex, a kind of sad understanding that was perhaps more devastating than any angry response could have been. "Mrs. Ashford, I appreciate that you're saying that now. But the fact is, you were ready to humiliate me and crush my dreams based on nothing more than your own prejudices. The only reason you're apologizing is because I was able to prove you wrong. What about all the other kids who might not have had my advantages? What about the ones who don't get a chance to demonstrate their worth through a piano performance?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Mrs. Ashford had no answer for it because she knew he was right. Her apology was motivated by the shock of being proven wrong, not by any genuine understanding of the harm her attitudes could cause. As the immediate drama of the moment began to settle, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway. The headmaster, Dr. Williams, appeared in the doorway, his face showing curiosity about the crowd that had gathered outside his music room. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order in his institution. Dr. Harrison quickly explained the situation, describing David's scholarship interview, Mrs. Ashford's challenge, and the extraordinary performance that had followed. As the story unfolded, Dr. Williams's expression shifted from confusion to amazement to something approaching anger as he understood how one of his prospective students had been treated. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice carrying a cold edge that made everyone in the room uncomfortable, "I'd like to speak with you privately, immediately." Mrs. Ashford nodded weakly, knowing that this conversation would not go well for her. As she prepared to leave with the headmaster, she turned back to David one more time. "I know my apology can't undo what I did," she said, her voice heavy with genuine remorse that was finally beginning to emerge. "But I want you to know that you've taught me something important today. About assumptions, about prejudice, about the danger of judging people before you know them." David studied her face for a moment, seeing something there that might have been the beginning of real understanding. "Mrs. Ashford, I hope you remember this feeling the next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your expectations. Maybe some good can come from this after all. 3 months later, David's performance had become the stuff of legend at Riverside Academy, though he never returned to claim his place there. The video recorded by students had spread far beyond the school's walls, eventually reaching the attention of music educators and professionals across the country. Within a week of the incident, David had received scholarship offers from 3 prestigious music conservatories and 2 elite private schools with strong music programs. He ultimately chose the Wellington Academy, a diverse institution known for its commitment to nurturing talent regardless of economic background. Mr. Chen, the security guard who had been David's secret mentor, was offered a position as adjunct piano instructor at the Metropolitan Music Conservatory after the story of his role in David's education became known. The conservatory's administration was embarrassed to learn that such a talented musician had been working in their building for years without anyone recognizing his abilities. Mrs. Ashford's position at Riverside Academy became untenable after the incident. The board of directors, faced with public scrutiny and questions about the school's values, asked for her resignation. The process was quiet and dignified, but the message was clear. Her attitudes had no place in an institution that claimed to value excellence and character. The experience changed her profoundly. Stripped of the social positions that had defined her identity, forced to confront the ugliness of her own prejudices, Mrs. Ashford began a difficult journey of self-examination and growth. She started volunteering at community centers in underserved neighborhoods, working with children who reminded her of David. 6 months after their confrontation, she attended one of David's public performances with the Wellington Youth Orchestra. She sat in the back of the auditorium, listening as he performed a Mozart concerto with the same breathtaking skill and musical sensitivity that had shattered her worldview in the Academy's music room. After the concert, she waited by the stage door, unsure of what she wanted to say but knowing she needed to speak with him. When David emerged, still glowing with the energy of a successful performance, he seemed genuinely surprised to see her. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice neutral but not unfriendly. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to hear you play again," she said simply. "I wanted to see how you were doing." They talked for a few minutes, and David told her about his new school, his continued lessons with Mr. Chen, his plans to audition for conservatory programs in a few years. Mrs. Ashford listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering sincere congratulations on his achievements. "David," she said finally, "I know I can never fully make up for how I treated you that day, but I want you to know that you changed my life. You forced me to see things about myself that I had been avoiding for years." David studied her face, seeing changes there that went deeper than just remorse. There was a humility in her expression that hadn't been there before, a recognition of her own fallibility that seemed to have made her more human. "I'm glad something positive came from it," he said. "I hope you found ways to use what you learned to help other people." Mrs. Ashford smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, the expression seemed completely genuine. "I'm trying. It's not easy to change patterns of thinking that have been with you for decades, but I'm working on it every day." As they parted ways that evening, both of them understood that their brief encounter at Riverside Academy had set in motion changes that would continue to ripple through their lives for years to come. David had learned that talent and character could overcome prejudice and that